The rain hadn't stopped in days. Heavy with leaden clouds, Seattle's sky seemed to press down on everything: the city, the streets, and Layla Monroe's chest. She stood outside the hospital, clutching a soaked folder filled with overdue bills, her nurse scrubs clinging to her skin. Her shift had ended hours ago, but her mother's oncologist had called her in for another conversation with no good news, only the gentle words people use to wrap despair in silk. "We've done all we can without the new treatment," he'd said, "but the insurance won't cover it. And I'm sorry, Layla. Sorry, didn't help. Sorry, I didn't pay for chemo. Sorry, I didn't keep her mother alive." Her phone buzzed as she reached the corner. No contact name, just a number she didn't recognize and a message: "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., FutureCore Tower, 88th floor. Ask for Ethan Caldwell." That was it. No explanation, no greeting, no threat. She almost deleted it. Scam, maybe? But something about the name Ethan Caldwell made her pause. Everyone in Seattle knew that name. CEO of FutureCore, the most powerful biotech company on the West Coast. He hadn't made a public appearance in 3 years, not since the accident that left him with a mysterious heart condition and rumors of paralysis. Some said he ran the company from a dark glass tower, like a ghost behind firewalls. Others claimed he was dying. All agreed on one thing: he was rich, brilliant, and unreachable. So why was he reaching for her? Layla pulled her pressed white blouse from the back of her closet the next morning. It wasn't much, just clean, starched, and paired with her one pair of black slacks that didn't scream hospital staff. She borrowed her neighbor's umbrella, tied her curls back into a neat bun, and told her 5-year-old son, Samuel, she'd return before dinner. She wasn't sure why she went. Desperation, maybe. Hope, though she hated that word lately. Or just the need to feel like she still had agency, some small ability to stand up when life tried to push her down. FutureCore Tower loomed over downtown like it owned the skyline. Chrome and glass, reflecting a city that never looked back. She passed through security with ease, too easily, and rode the private elevator up. Each floor ticked off in silence. The 88th floor opened not to an office, but a gallery of silence. Black marble floors, wall-length windows, and a curated hush. He was already there. Ethan Caldwell stood with his back to her, tall and still, his profile sharp against the skyline. Gray suit, silver at the temples, and a presence that shifted the air slightly. She hadn't expected him to be standing. She hadn't expected him to turn. But he did, slowly, intentionally. And when his eyes met hers, calm, calculating, and unreadable, she felt like the floor might disappear beneath her feet. "I'll be brief," he said, voice low, smooth as glass. "I need a wife." Layla blinked. She hadn't even opened her mouth yet. "I need to fulfill a clause in my trust before the next board review," he continued. "Marriage, not romance, not a partnership, a contract. 1 year. Name and presence only." She didn't move. Her hands were cold. Her voice wouldn't come. "In return," he added, sliding a folder across a sleek table between them, "I'll pay off every debt in your name, secure your mother's treatment, and provide for your son's education, private, all the way to college." Finally, her voice cracked through. "Why me?" "Because you're invisible," he replied, without cruelty. "You have nothing to gain, but everything to protect, which makes you loyal. Loyal." It stung, but it also made sense in a way she hated. She looked down at the folder, crisp paper, typed terms. She flipped through pages and barely registered clauses about discretion, public appearances, separate quarters, and no expectation of intimacy. It was cold, but death was colder. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. 1 year? 1 year, he confirmed. And after that? We walk away. She signed her name. He signed his. He extended his hand, and she hesitated before placing hers in his. To a new chapter, he said. But it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like surrender. Layla stared at the ring on her finger in the back seat of the town car that took her home. It wasn't flashy, simple gold, but it pressed against her skin like a weight, like a secret. She hadn't said yes because of love. She hadn't even said yes because of hope. She'd said yes because someone finally gave her a choice, even if it was built on terms she hadn't set. And somewhere in the silence between two strangers and a signature, something had begun. Not a marriage. Not yet. But a crack. A shift. And sometimes, all it takes is a crack for the light to get in. We'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this story stirred something in you. Would you have made the same decision as Layla? Comment below. Tap like if you believe in second chances. And follow this channel for the next part. Because love sometimes starts not with a kiss, but with a contract. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. A clerk with tired eyes read through the formalities, with all the emotion of someone reciting a grocery list. 2 signatures. 1 witness. 1 metal detector was humming softly in the background. There were no flowers, no friends, no champagne. Just Layla in her pressed blouse and Ethan in his storm gray suit, standing apart like passengers on separate trains that had briefly pulled into the same station. The judge glanced at them only once. Do you both consent to the terms listed here? Yes, Ethan replied without hesitation. Layla's voice was quieter. Yes, and that was it. The clerk slid a plain gold band onto her finger, not the groom. Ethan didn't reach for her hand, smile, or even offer a ceremonial gesture. Layla, too stunned to process, looked down at the ring. It was perfectly fit, but unfamiliar, like a borrowed coat in a stranger's closet. When they stepped outside, the air had turned colder. She hadn't noticed the wind picking up, but it threaded through her blouse, and she pulled her coat tighter. The car that waited was sleek, dark, anonymous, just like him. The driver opened the door. Ethan gestured for her to enter first, but still said nothing. The silence between them filled the space like smoke. Thick, invisible, inescapable. Seattle's skyline blurred past the tinted windows as they drove toward the penthouse that would now, legally, be her home. Layla watched the city fall away. The clinic, the bus stops, the corner store where she bought cereal and secondhand magazines. She wasn't sure if she was moving forward or leaving something essential behind. The car eased into a private underground garage. As they stepped into the private elevator, Layla caught a faint reflection of them in the mirrored walls. She looked like a secretary from a dream she didn't remember agreeing to. He looked like a man carved from winter. The penthouse was stunning. That was her first thought. The kind of people have when they're too overwhelmed to think deeper. Floor-to-ceiling glass, polished floors, and curated artwork that likely cost more than her entire salary last year. A view of Puget Sound stretched beyond the windows, waves moving like a sleeping creature beneath the clouds. But something was missing. No books, no clutter, no evidence of life. It was beautiful, and it was hollow. "This is yours," Ethan said quietly, gesturing toward a suite down the hall. "You'll find everything you need." He moved away then, not waiting to see if she followed. No tour, no instructions, just a set of keys on a marble counter and a deliberately cultivated silence. Layla stood in the entryway, long before finally walking to her room. The suite was as elegant as the rest: cream linens, brushed gold fixtures, and a balcony overlooking the water. Her suitcase had been brought in, resting neatly at the foot of the bed. Someone had even stocked the closet with tailored dresses, shoes in her size, and sleepwear that felt too expensive to touch. She changed into something comfortable, sweats and a cotton tee, and wandered into the kitchen, more from instinct than hunger. The refrigerator was stocked with imported cheeses, berries, and cuts of meat wrapped in butcher paper. A stark contrast to the cup noodles and discount groceries she was used to. She stared at the shelves, then closed the door. It felt like trespassing. That night, when she climbed into bed, she listened, half expecting the sounds of a neighbor's footsteps, a baby crying through paper-thin walls, the buzz of her cheap space heater kicking in. But there was only silence. Impeccable, crushing silence. She lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, trying to remember why she'd said yes. Her mother's smile flickered in her mind. Samuel's soft voice asked if Nana would get better. That's why. Not for herself. For them. But still, something in her chest felt unsettled. Not regret, exactly. Just a cold awareness that she had stepped into something carefully constructed and utterly void of warmth. The next morning, she woke to a note on the dining table. Breakfast is prepared at 7. My assistant will bring your schedule. The clinic will be ready for your mother by Friday. E. She held the paper for a moment longer than necessary, trying to read between the lines that weren't there. True to his word, every arrangement was handled swiftly. Her mother was moved into one of the top medical facilities in the city. Private room, whole care team, latest treatment plan mapped out. Layla visited her daily, and she wondered who she had become whenever she walked through the gleaming hospital corridors, dressed now in tailored coats and polished boots provided by her new life. In public, she was Mrs. Caldwell. People looked at her differently now. Receptionists straightened up when she walked in. Drivers opened doors before she reached them. Even the air around her seemed to bend in deference. But in private, she was still Layla. Still unsure, still bracing herself every time she stepped through the penthouse door. Ethan was never cruel, never raised his voice, never made her feel small. But he also never really saw her. They shared meals if he was home, breakfast in silence, dinners where silverware clinked louder than conversation. Once she asked about his company, and he replied with a single sentence. It runs itself now. Then went back to eating. He never asked about Samuel, never asked why she looked tired, where she went during the day, or what she thought about anything. At night, he retired to his side of the penthouse, another suite entirely, and she remained in hers. The space between them wasn't just physical, it was deliberate, maintained, and yet, she caught moments, small, flickering things that didn't match his carefully drawn mask. A half-open drawer filled with old sheet music, a photograph, tucked behind books, of a young boy playing cello in a sunlit room, a whisper of a dream once cherished, now buried under the weight of logic. Once, she heard him coughing through the walls, harsh, ragged, and then abruptly silenced. When she knocked softly, the door opened just a crack, and he stood there, pale, composed, shirt rumpled. "I'm fine," he said, too quickly. She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. Not yet. Instead, she returned to her room, crawled into bed, and lay awake long after the city below had gone quiet. She had married a man with power, money, and control. But underneath all that, she wondered, had she also married a ghost? The rain returned the following week, soft, then steady. Seattle's quiet signature. Layla had started to find a rhythm in her strange new life, one built not on intimacy, but coordination, a routine of polite exchanges, scheduled deliveries, and clinical detachment. Ethan remained an enigma, always neatly dressed, always composed. They moved through the same rooms like actors on different stages, never crossing marks unless the script required it. But one evening, the script faltered. It was nearly midnight when Layla padded into the kitchen barefoot, craving something warm. She'd had trouble sleeping again, and the silence of the penthouse had begun to take on a peculiar weight. Less like peace, more like pressure. She filled a kettle and reached for a cup. And that's when she heard it. A sound, soft, strained. Not the wind, not the hum of the refrigerator. A voice. She turned, confused, then followed the faint noise down the hallway, past the gallery of modern art and untouched seating areas. The sound grew clearer, muffled, broken. Her steps slowed as she reached the farthest room. The door was ajar. Inside, Ethan lay on the couch, caught in the throes of a nightmare. His body, always so contained, now thrashed in small, involuntary motions. His jaw clenched. A sheen of sweat glistened across his forehead, and from his parted lips came fragments of words, distorted, lost. Layla hesitated, caught on the threshold between their silent agreement and something she hadn't been invited into. But then his hand jerked, clutching at air. She stepped inside. "Ethan," she said gently. No response. "Ethan." She tried again, lightly touching his arm. His eyes flew open. He looked right through her for a heartbeat. Wild, unguarded, afraid. Then recognition returned, crashing in like a tide. His breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling too quickly beneath the thin fabric of his sleep shirt. She didn't move. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "I didn't expect—" He stopped, shook his head. "It was just a dream." She nodded, though she didn't believe it. "You were calling out," she said softly. His gaze flicked away. "It doesn't matter." "It does if it keeps you from sleeping," she replied, not unkindly. He sat up, exhaled slowly, and rubbed a hand across his face. Some memories don't stay buried, no matter how much concrete you pour over them. She didn't ask for more, and he didn't offer it. But something changed in that moment. A crack, small but unmistakable, opened in the perfectly polished glass of their arrangement. After that night, their silence shifted, not gone, but different, less final, more curious. They rarely spoke during meals, but occasionally their eyes met and lingered. Once she found him in the library, fingers trailing the spine of a worn biography on cardiac research. He didn't notice her, but she saw how his shoulders dropped when the book slipped back into place. Like someone reaching for comfort and remembering it was gone. Another time, she saw him pause before stepping into the elevator, pressing a hand discreetly to his chest. His jaw tightened, and his breath hitched. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. He straightened immediately, nodding without meeting her eyes. "It's nothing." She let it go, but she remembered. Layla began to notice more details, small, fragile things that made him human. A half-used mug was left near the windowsill. A music playlist was cued, but never played. A drawer in his study was filled with letters, none opened. He wasn't cruel, he was careful. And beneath that care was pain. Meanwhile, her days revolved around the hospital. Her mother's health had begun to stabilize, thanks to the treatments now fully covered and the comfort of a private room. Every time Layla visited, her mother asked the same question. "And how is your husband?" She never knew quite how to answer. "He's kind," she said once. It wasn't false, not fully. When she returned to the penthouse that evening, she found a note on the counter in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Samuel's school application has been approved. Enrollment starts next month. I've made the necessary arrangements. E. She stood there for a long time, reading it over again, as if the meaning might shift in the spaces between his words. He hadn't asked if she wanted that. He'd given it. It wasn't a gesture made for show. There was no audience, just a man moving behind walls, offering something in the only language he seemed to know. Provision. Still, she felt a pang. He never asked how Samuel liked to spend his afternoons, whether he wanted to draw, build with blocks, or was still afraid of the dark. Ethan moved the pieces on the board, but never touched the heart of the game. Late one night, Layla found herself curled in an armchair near the window, the lights dimmed, the city glowing faintly beyond the glass. She was reading, but not really. Her thoughts wandered, restless, looping. Footsteps approached behind her. She looked up to see Ethan entering the room, barefoot, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was no file in his hand, no device in his ear, just him. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said. She shrugged. Too quiet. He crossed the room but didn't sit, just stood near the window, gazing out. "Sometimes I think I built this place to keep the world out," he murmured. "But lately, it feels more like keeping something in." She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "Maybe it's time to open the door." He glanced at her, something flickering behind his expression. Wary, uncertain, but not entirely closed. He nodded once, then walked away. And yet, that night, for the first time since their wedding, he didn't return to his separate wing. He slept in his bed. But this time, it was the bed they shared. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. But the space between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge waiting to be crossed. The envelope arrived on a silver tray, delivered by one of Ethan's assistants with no expression and fewer words. Layla stared at the embossed seal, uncertain whether to open it. Her name was written in clean, deliberate strokes. No title, just Layla Monroe, as if the sender had chosen to erase the Mrs. Caldwell she was supposed to be. Inside was an invitation. FutureCore's annual winter gala. Black tie, 7:00 p.m. Olympic Grand Hall. There was no note from Ethan, no message asking if she wanted to attend, no signature, just the expectation of presence. That evening, she returned to her suite and found a gown hanging on the back of her closet door. It was deep sapphire, elegant, understated, but undeniably stunning. The kind of dress that knew how to whisper rather than shout. Alongside it, a small velvet box cradled a delicate silver necklace, its pendant a single opal suspended like moonlight. Layla touched the fabric of the gown with tentative fingers. There was something strange about being chosen for something so beautiful when you hadn't asked for it, hadn't earned it. But still, she dressed. She pinned her curls into a low twist, painted her lips a quiet crimson, and stepped into the heels left neatly beside her bed. When she emerged, Ethan was already waiting by the door. He wore black. Of course he did. A tailored tuxedo that fit him like it had been cut from silence. His cufflinks gleamed softly in the low light. His posture was precise, as always. But when he turned and saw her, something flickered across his face, an involuntary pause. His gaze moved over her, not hungrily, not possessively, but reverently. "You look," he started, then stopped. Layla offered a faint smile. "Different?" "Real," he said quietly. "You look real." They didn't speak during the car ride, but the silence was no longer heavy. It felt like breath held in anticipation. The Olympic Grand Hall was a glass and steel cathedral decked in crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed linen. The city's elite filled the room like moving portraits. CEOs, politicians, socialites whose smiles were sharper than diamonds. And then there was her. Layla felt their stares. She felt the whispering eyes on her skin, measuring, calculating, wondering. A young woman with skin like honey and poise too calm for her presumed background. A nurse turned wife, a stranger wrapped in silk. But Ethan didn't flinch. He stood beside her with quiet authority, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Not possessive, but grounding. When he introduced her, he used her full name, his voice steady, never clipped. And not once did he look away. Yet not everyone followed his lead. Wallace Greer, the vice president of FutureCore, approached during the third round of champagne. He wore his usual smirk, the kind Layla had seen on men who liked their power a little too much, and their women a little too quiet. "Well," Wallace drawled, raising his glass. "So this is the woman who's managed to bring Ethan Caldwell out of his fortress. I must admit, Mrs. Caldwell, you're quite the enigma." Layla tilted her head politely. "Only to people who assume they know the ending before they've read the first page." His smirk faltered, but just for a second. Ethan's eyes didn't leave Wallace's face. "She's not a mystery," he said calmly. "She's my wife." It was the first time he'd said it like that, like it mattered. The rest of the evening blurred into fragments. Music swelling, toasts echoing, dancers gliding across the marble floor like ghosts. Layla danced with Ethan once, only once. But it was enough. His hand against hers. His eyes searched hers with a quiet intensity. No one watching would have guessed they hadn't always danced together, that she'd once scrubbed floors while he closed billion-dollar deals, that their union had been born in ink, not affection. They didn't speak on the drive home. And yet, when they arrived at the penthouse, Ethan didn't retreat. He stood by the window, jacket shrugged off, shirt sleeves rolled up, the city glinting beyond him like a promise half-kept. Layla stepped toward him, the hem of her gown whispering against the floor. "You didn't have to bring me," she said. He turned slowly. "But I wanted to." "Why?" His voice was quieter now. "Because when you're near, it doesn't feel so empty." She wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it didn't matter. One step, then another. Their hands found each other again. Not out of obligation, not out of performance, but from something quieter, truer. When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't urgent. It was reverent. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything except to be felt. And she felt it. The warmth of his palm at her jaw. The way his breath trembled slightly as their foreheads touched. The way he whispered her name like it meant something he hadn't dared believe in until now. Layla. And for the first time since she'd walked into his tower, Layla didn't feel like a placeholder. She felt chosen, seen, not as a contract, not as a silhouette beside a powerful man, but as herself. Later, long after the city quieted and the dress had slipped to the floor like water, they lay beside each other in the hush of shared breath. No words, just the slow rhythm of two hearts remembering how to beat in unison. She rested her head against his chest, and this time, the silence between them felt full. The city was still wrapped in the early morning hush when Layla stirred. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the fog floated low over Puget Sound, veiling the water in a soft silver hush. The usual rhythm of traffic and ferry horns hadn't begun yet, and for the first time since she moved into the penthouse, she awoke without a sense of caution. She turned slightly and found Ethan lying beside her. Not rigid, not distant, asleep. His breathing was slow and steady. One arm rested near the center of the bed, not curled defensively at the edge as he always had. She studied the lines of his face in this rare moment of vulnerability. The faint shadow of a crease between his brows, even in sleep. The way his lashes brushed against the top of his cheek. The small scar at his temple that softened him in ways his suits never could. Layla didn't move. Something in the stillness felt sacred. Minutes passed before he stirred. When he finally opened his eyes, they didn't flicker with that usual guarded awareness. Instead, they met her directly, quietly. "Good morning," he said, voice gravelly from sleep. "Morning," she replied softly. Neither reached for the other, yet the air between them hummed with something unspoken, like a secret shared but not named. They lay there longer, watching the fog rise and dissolve across the city. And then, as if summoned by gravity, Ethan's hand found hers beneath the covers. He didn't squeeze, didn't shift closer, just linked their fingers gently, as if testing whether the moment would stay. It did. Breakfast was different that day. The dining room, usually pristine and silent, held warmth. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, brushing the dark wood with gold. Layla wore one of the silk robes that had appeared in her closet weeks ago, but remained untouched until now. Ethan entered in an open-collar shirt, hair slightly tousled, and for the first time, without his usual watch, like time had decided to pause for them. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking how she took hers, then placed one in front of her. "You remembered," she murmured. "Cinnamon and a drop of oat milk," he said, then smiled faintly. "I pay attention." She arched a brow, amused. "Only when you're not trying so hard not to." His smile deepened, though it didn't linger. There was still something behind his eyes, stillness with a shadow underneath. After breakfast, he disappeared into his study. Layla didn't follow. Some lines were not yet hers to cross. But later that afternoon, as she passed the hallway, she heard the soft hum of a cello. She paused. The sound was faint, barely there, as though coming from another room, or another time. Not live, but recorded. Classical, melancholic. She recognized the piece. Elgar's Cello Concerto in E minor. A haunting composition, heavy with longing. She pushed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Ethan stood at the window, back to her, his phone lying on the desk, the music drifting from it like breath. He didn't turn, but he knew she was there. "That was my brother's favorite," he said quietly. Layla didn't speak. "He used to play it," he continued. "Before the accident." She stepped inside, her footsteps light. "You never mentioned a brother." "I don't talk about him." "Was he older?" "Younger," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "By 5 years. Bright, loud, lived like nothing could touch him. Until something did." She waited. Then, carefully, "The accident." His shoulders tightened, just slightly. "I was driving." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, full of things not easily spoken. "I survived," he said. He didn't. Layla stepped closer but didn't touch him. "You don't have to explain," she said gently. "I know," he replied. "But maybe I want to." She waited again, offering the only thing he seemed to accept from her without resistance. Presence. "My heart condition didn't come from the crash," he said finally. "It's genetic. The accident just accelerated everything. Trauma like that pulls the curtain back, shows you what's already broken." He turned slowly, afraid of what he'd find in her face, but she didn't look away. "It was after he died," he said, "that I stopped letting people in. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't know how to anymore. Layla reached for his hand. This time, he let her take it without hesitation. You haven't forgotten how, she said softly. He searched her face. Then why does it still feel so hard? Because it matters now. He didn't respond, but his hand tightened around hers. That night, he didn't retreat behind walls. They had dinner together, authentic dinner, not silent bites at opposite ends of the table. He asked her questions, not about logistics or appointments, but about memories. Childhood, dreams, Samuel. She told him stories about growing up in Atlanta, baking with her grandmother on Sundays, and wanting to become a surgeon before life pushed her into caregiving too early. You still could, he said. She laughed softly. At 27, with a child and a complicated fake marriage? He didn't smile. Why not? She didn't answer. But the question stayed with her long after the dishes were cleared. Later, as she walked past his study again, she found a photo frame face down on the bookshelf. Without touching it, she glanced at the nameplate beneath the image. Ethan Caldwell, 1990-2018. The face in the photo was bright-eyed, mischievous. She gently turned the frame upright, then walked away. Ethan was already in bed upstairs, shirtless beneath the sheets, one arm folded behind his head. His eyes followed her as she entered, moved toward the dresser, undressed, and joined him without ceremony. No words. But when she settled beside him, he shifted, not away, but toward. His fingers found her wrist, moved slowly along the inside of her arm, not with desire, not yet, but with familiarity, the beginnings of comfort. And in the quiet of that room, in the stillness between breath and body, Layla felt something she hadn't known she needed. Not affection, not even understanding, but trust, unearned, fragile, and real. And it was enough for now. Seattle's sky was moody again, gray and brooding, the day when the horizon felt like it had been rubbed out with charcoal. Rain tapped gently on the glass panes of the penthouse, not hard yet, but steadily enough to wrap the city in a hush. Layla stood at the kitchen counter, slicing lemons with a deliberateness that betrayed the tension she carried in her shoulders. The scent of thyme and garlic filled the air. Rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, and a bowl of lemon rice cooling on the stove. She hadn't planned on cooking. The idea had arrived somewhere between memory and instinct. She only knew that the silence had begun to feel too still, too perfect, too manufactured. The penthouse needed something tangible. By the time Ethan returned, the sky had gone nearly black. His coat was damp, his hair tousled by the wind, but he paused in the doorway like he'd entered an entirely different house. You cooked? He asked, genuinely surprised. Layla looked up from where she was setting the table. Don't worry, she said, half smiling. I didn't poison anything. I promise. His mouth twitched. That's oddly reassuring. He took off his coat slowly, hung it by the door, and approached the dining table with cautious curiosity. The food was simple, modest even, but it smelled of warmth and time. Not catered, not curated, and just made. They sat down together, not opposite ends of the long table this time, but side by side, close enough to share the candlelight. The first few minutes were quiet, forks on ceramic, the occasional sip of water. But then something softened. He asked about her mother's physical therapy. She asked about his schedule. And then, just as the conversation started to taper off, he surprised her. My board of directors, he said dryly, are more robotic than the AI prototypes they approved last quarter. She laughed, genuinely. And yet they trust you to build emotional empathy into machines? They think emotions are code, that they can be simulated and quantified. He paused, a faint note of bitterness in his voice. Maybe I used to think that too. Layla watched him for a moment. His face was open like it rarely was. Not unreadable, not calculated, just present. Do you miss it? She asked softly. Feeling things? I didn't stop feeling, he replied. I just stopped showing it. Somewhere along the line, I convinced myself that expression made everything harder. He leaned back slightly, glancing at her. But you've made it harder not to. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the kitchen had gone quiet, they found themselves standing by the sink. She dried her hands with a linen towel. He stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, a dish in hand. The juxtaposition struck her. This powerful man, rinsing a plate beneath warm water, shoulders relaxed, expression unguarded. Their fingers brushed as she reached for the bowl he held. He froze, then looked up. The air shifted, subtle and sudden. Neither moved for a moment, but something passed between them. Acknowledgement, curiosity, a pull neither of them had quite named. Layla's breath caught, not out of surprise, but because it felt expected, like they'd been walking toward this pause for days. That night, he didn't retreat to his separate wing. He came to bed first, lying quietly on the far side, unsure of the rules. Layla joined him minutes later, slipping beneath the covers. She didn't face him. Neither did he. But the distance between them wasn't avoidance. It was patience. A few days later, a white box appeared on her bed, nestled beside a folded note. Inside, she found a dress, deep blue satin, elegant but not ostentatious. The fabric pooled like water in her hands. The note was brief. Olympic Club Gala. Tomorrow. Transportation at 6:45. E. No explanation. No question. But this time, it didn't feel like a command. It felt like an invitation. She spent longer than usual getting ready the following evening. Not for them, whatever them was, but for herself. The dress hugged her like a second skin. She added a single silver pin to her hair. Her makeup was soft, and her lips were the color of ripe cherries. When she descended the staircase, Ethan stood waiting near the elevator, his tuxedo cut sharp and precise, but his expression gave her pause. He looked at her as if he hadn't realized how much space she occupied until now. You look, he began, but stopped. Layla smiled. Real? He shook his head slightly. You look like the beginning of something. The gala was a blur of chandeliers and velvet, low conversations, and high expectations. Everyone turned when they entered. Murmurs floated like perfume in the air. Layla kept her chin high and shoulders back, Ethan's hand resting gently at her back like an anchor. Wallace Greer was the first to break the surface. Well, he said with his usual polished sneer. The lady of the hour. Layla matched his gaze, measured. Wallace, she replied, neutral and cool. You've certainly elevated the room, he said, tilting his glass toward Ethan, or at least changed the tone. Some tones need changing, Ethan said, his voice even, but his hand on Layla's back tightened slightly. Later, as they danced, she whispered, Does he always talk to you like that? Ethan's eyes were calm, but his voice was sharper. Only when he's trying to be important. The orchestra played something soft, something without words, and they moved as if they'd done this 1,000 times. Layla's hand rested just over his heart. It beat slowly beneath her palm, steady and sure. After the last note, they didn't speak, just left. Back in the penthouse, the city lights shimmered beneath the windows, like a secret waiting to be shared. Ethan didn't guide her to bed. He didn't need to. He took her hand and led her to the glass, the skyline reflecting everything they hadn't said. "Layla," he murmured. She turned. "You didn't have to come tonight," he said. "But I did, and I'm glad." He hesitated, then, quieter. "Because when you're here, I remember what it feels like to want something more than survival." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached up and kissed him. Not out of gratitude, not because it was owed, but because it had been building quietly, insistently. It had nowhere else to go. When their lips met, it wasn't dramatic. It was slow, deep, measured. It was as if each breath was a thread pulling two lives closer together, weaving something they hadn't expected to want. They didn't rush. They let it happen. A kiss, a breath, a beginning. For the first time since they signed their names on paper, no one had witnessed them. It wasn't about contracts or arrangements. It was about choosing. In the quiet aftermath, with the city beyond them and the room wrapped in darkness, they stood there, still touching, still steady. Not strangers, not quite lovers, but something in between, something honest, something becoming. The morning after, Seattle woke in layers of light. Mist clung to the rooftops like a lover reluctant to let go, and the city, for once, seemed unhurried. Inside the penthouse, time felt slower, softer. Layla stood barefoot by the kitchen island, Ethan's oversized button-down shirt draped over her frame. The fabric carried the scent of cedar and warmth, faint but unmistakable. She wasn't used to feeling this still. Her world was always chaotic. Shifts, alarms, hospital corridors, and soft footsteps on linoleum. But now, it was a rhythm of breath, of silence that didn't press but held. Behind her, Ethan emerged, hair tousled and barefoot, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned just enough to feel like permission. He looked less like the man who signed billion-dollar contracts, and more like someone who remembered what it meant to rest. He reached for the coffee pot, pouring her a cup before his own. No conversation, just two people moving through the same morning with the quiet comfort of shared space. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about business or logistics. It wasn't even about the night before. "I've never brought anyone here," he said, his voice low, steady. "Not really. This place was always a fortress." Layla looked at him over her mug. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now it feels like a home with the lights turned on." She didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Later that afternoon, she visited her mother at the clinic. The improvement in her condition was undeniable. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her voice, once thin and trembling, now carried a strength that hadn't been there in months. "I haven't seen you smile like this in years," her mother said, watching her over the rim of a paper cup. Layla shrugged, unable to suppress the curve of her lips. "I guess I forgot how." "And this Ethan, he makes you remember?" Layla hesitated. "He doesn't try to. That's the difference." She didn't mention the complications, the contract, the beginning that wasn't a beginning. But her mother didn't press. Some things didn't need to be explained when they were written across a daughter's face. That night, Layla returned to the penthouse and found Ethan on the rooftop terrace. He was seated on one of the cushioned benches, blanket draped over his legs, a mug cupped between his hands. The skyline sprawled beyond him, lights like scattered embers, the sound of distant traffic a lullaby. She stepped out quietly. He looked up. "Cold?" she asked. "Not anymore." She settled beside him, pulling the edge of the blanket over her lap. For a while, they just sat. No music, no wine. Just shared a breath in the space between them. Then, slowly, Ethan said, "I have something I need to tell you." Layla turned her head. The tone in his voice was different, measured, braced. "I went to see a specialist today," he said. "I've been managing my condition quietly, but it's progressing. Faster than expected." Her stomach tightened. "How bad?" He didn't look away. "Bad enough that I don't know how much time I have. It could be years. It could be months. There's a therapy option. Experimental, risky, but I'm not guaranteed anything." Silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with questions neither of them wanted to voice. "And that's why you wanted the marriage," Layla said quietly. "So your name, your company, your legacy would continue even if you didn't." Ethan nodded once. "I didn't plan on falling in love with the woman I asked to help me disappear." Her breath caught. "And I didn't expect you," he continued, his voice rough. "But I don't know how to protect you from what might come." Layla looked at him. His jaw was set, but his eyes were wide open, no longer hiding. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. His entire body stilled. The wind rustled against the edge of the rooftop. Below, the city moved on, unaware. He stared at her, not with panic, not with fear, but with a kind of awe that couldn't be spoken. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking. She nodded. "I wanted to tell you tonight, before I found out about this." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he set the mug down and dropped to his knees before her. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't scripted. He pressed his forehead gently against her abdomen, his hand resting against the soft cotton of her dress. She felt the tremble in him. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to stay when the odds say I'll leave you too soon." Layla placed her hand over his. "Then let's not talk about odds," she said. "Let's talk about now." He looked up at her, and in his eyes was the man he used to be, the boy who lost a brother, the CEO who built walls no one could scale, and the man who, somehow, had begun to dismantle them for her. That night, he didn't sleep in silence. He wrapped himself around her in the darkness, his hand resting gently against her belly, his breath brushing her shoulder like a vow he didn't yet have the language to speak. And as the wind howled faintly beyond the glass, Layla whispered into the space between them, "You're not going anywhere." He didn't answer, but his arms pulled her closer, and for now, that was enough. The days after the rooftop confession passed in a fragile hush, like the quiet before a storm you could smell but not see. Ethan became even more attentive, though not in ways most people would expect. He didn't hover. He didn't overwhelm her with gestures. Instead, he was present in every room she walked into. She'd find an extra napkin already at her elbow when she stirred her tea. When she returned from a doctor's visit, he'd be waiting with her favorite soup, chicken, ginger, and rice, even though he claimed he'd never learned to cook anything that didn't require a microwave. One morning, she woke to find his watch beside her coffee cup. It was an old piece, scratched, the leather band soft and worn. She turned it over to find it ticking quietly, tucked against a note scribbled in clean, slanted handwriting. "Time isn't the enemy. It's the reason I want to fight. E." She didn't cry, not then, but later, when she stood in front of the nursery room, a room they hadn't yet touched, still full of forgotten blueprints and unpacked boxes. She pressed her hand gently to her stomach and whispered, "You're already loved, even by someone who doesn't know how to say it yet." By the end of the week, the two of them had settled into a tender rhythm. Dinners were quieter, but less empty. Ethan began working from home more often, not because his health demanded it, but because he no longer saw his empire as more urgent than the life unfolding in his kitchen. But hope, as always, didn't come without its cost. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning had begun like any other. Gray skies, the smell of toast. Layla's soft laughter at something Samuel had scribbled during their video call. Ethan had absent-mindedly kissed her hand before taking a call in his study. But by late afternoon, something shifted. She felt an ache in her lower back first, then a cramp. At first, she thought it was fatigue. She tried to rest. She drank water. But the discomfort deepened, spiraled inward. Her skin was dampened with sweat, and her breath grew uneven. By the time she stumbled into the hallway, calling Ethan's name, the pain had sharpened into something urgent and terrifying. He was already halfway across the apartment, his voice tight and steady. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she gasped, clutching the side of her abdomen. "Something's not right." He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she was in the car, his hand wrapped around hers, his eyes darting between her and the road ahead. The windshield wipers thudded against the glass as the rain began to fall harder, Seattle's skyline blurring behind a wall of water. "Hold on," he murmured again and again. "Hold on, love. We're almost there." The emergency room lights were too bright. Everything after that moved like a montage. Nurses asking questions, Layla gasping for air. A gurney wheeled away faster than Ethan could follow. And then, silence. He sat alone in the hallway, palms pressed together, elbows on his knees. His suit jacket had been forgotten somewhere along the way. His phone buzzed once. He didn't look. Time passed in a way that didn't feel linear. When the doctor finally emerged, Ethan stood before the man, not even speaking. "She's stable," the doctor said. "It was a threatened miscarriage, but we were able to stop the bleeding. She's resting now." "And the baby?" Ethan asked, voice like gravel. The doctor gave a tired but genuine nod, still holding on. Relief hit him with the force of a wave. He swayed slightly, but caught himself. Later, in recovery, he stepped into the dim room and saw her, pale against the sheets, eyes half-lidded but awake. "Ethan," she whispered. He dropped to his knees beside her bed and took her hand. "You scared me to death," he said, his voice cracking. "You were there," she replied. "That's all that matters." He kissed her knuckles, then pressed his forehead to her palm. "I swear to you," he said, barely more than breath, "we're going to get through this. You, me, and this tiny fighter inside you." And for the first time, he said it aloud. Our child. Not as a formality, not as a contingency, but as a hope, a heartbeat, a future. The following days passed in a haze of caution. Layla was placed on strict bed rest. Ethan cleared his schedule without hesitation. The penthouse transformed, no longer sterile, no longer distant. Books began to appear at her bedside, flowers she hadn't asked for. He tried cooking again, scrambled eggs that turned gray in the pan, but she laughed so hard at the taste that it made the failure sweet. They talked more than ever, late into the night, about music, childhood, regret, redemption. One evening, as the city lights shimmered outside and the soft glow of the bedside lamp flickered across her skin, Ethan touched her cheek and said, almost shyly, "I never thought someone like you would end up with someone like me." She didn't smile. She reached for his hand and placed it gently over the curve of her stomach. "You saved my life," she whispered, "and gave me a future I thought I'd lost." His voice went rough. "You saved me first. Before I even touched you, you touched something I didn't know could come back. And then, as if their son had been listening, waiting, he kicked, just once. But it was enough. Enough to remind them that everything fragile can still be real. Enough to make Ethan cry, silently, forehead pressed to her belly, heart wide open. Enough to keep fighting. For time. For each other. For a story that had started on paper and contract, but had become something far more sacred. The week after the scare passed in a layer of haze, not quite worry, not quite peace. It was that peculiar stillness known only to those who faced loss, but still have hope, who still have someone to hold their hand, breathe beside them, and believe that tomorrow might begin again. Layla had been moved home to the spacious bedroom where afternoon light stretched long through the silk curtains. Ethan didn't let her walk more than a few steps. Everything she needed, books, lemon water, warm sweaters, appeared before she could ask. He didn't speak much, but each of his small actions seemed to carry their language, a silent apology, a thank you left unspoken, a love learning to express itself through hands and glances instead of words. One early morning, as Layla drifted between dream and waking, she heard the soft clink of a mug on the bedside table. A trace of mint lingered in the air. Ethan was sitting there, hair tousled, dark circles under his eyes unhidden. A soft leather notebook rested open on his lap, a page covered in careful handwriting. He didn't notice she was awake. "Which name do you like better?" he asked, still looking at the page. "Jonah or Elias?" She blinked. "You're choosing names? We've been calling him the baby for too long." He turned to look at her, his gaze steady this time. "He needs a name, something to hold on to." Layla sat up, pulling the blanket over her belly. "Jonah sounds gentle," she said softly. "Elias feels steadier." Ethan smiled faintly, a rare, quiet smile that twisted something in her chest. "What if it's two?" She raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. "The doctor hasn't said for sure. But you tend to defy every prediction." Layla laughed, soft and warm. "Then I'll start thinking of a girl's name too." Layla woke from a short nap and found the room silent that afternoon. She rose slowly, hand instinctively resting over her belly. Every movement now came with caution, not just for her health, but for something sacred. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard the faint sound of piano keys. The melody was uneven, hesitant in places, like someone trying to remember something long buried. She followed the sound to the room that had always been locked, the one Ethan never mentioned. The door was ajar, and in the dim light, she saw him, seated at the dust-covered piano, fingers touching the keys with uncertainty and honesty. He turned when he sensed her presence, but didn't close the lid. "I used to play," he said, "before the accident, before Julian." Layla stepped inside, sitting on the long bench beside him. "And now?" "Now. I play to remember I'm still alive." They sat there without touching, but their breathing moved in unison. Ethan began to play again, this time slower, more deliberate. Layla didn't recognize the piece, but felt what lived inside the notes. Grief, hope, a silent confession. Chatsamanti. One evening, when cold wind swept in from Puget Sound, Layla woke midnight to find Ethan gone from their bed. She found him in his study, the desk lamp casting a warm glow over a thick folder before him. His face was tense, his fingers curled around the edge of a page. "Something wrong?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Ethan looked up, hesitation in his eyes. "They want me to step down." "The board?" He nodded. "They don't trust a CEO with one foot in the grave. They're questioning every decision lately, even transferring shares into your name. They think I've lost perspective." "Have you?" Layla asked, not accusing, just honest. Ethan rose and stepped closer, his voice low. "I don't know how everything will turn out. But the only thing I know I want to keep is you and this child." She placed her hand on his chest, where the heart once declared incurable still beat beneath her palm. "It's still beating," she said. "Because of you," he whispered. They stood in silence for a long time. No one tried to prove anything. No one needed promises. Just two people, in a world that kept shifting, finding their truest footing in each other. By the weekend, they returned to the hospital for a routine checkup. The doctor smiled after listening to the baby's heartbeat. "Sounds like a little drummer warming up," she joked. "Very strong." As they left the ultrasound room, Ethan paused on a bench in the hallway. "I never thought I'd get here," he said, staring at the printout. Layla sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Me neither. But you did," he said. "And so did I." There was no dramatic moment, no declarations, no epiphanies, just a man who had once locked his heart away, sitting in the middle of a busy hospital, gripping the ultrasound photo of his child, and a woman who once believed love was a luxury, leaning into that man like she'd finally found where she belonged. Inside her, life continued to grow quietly, powerfully. Outside, a love took form, not loudly, not urgently, but real, and both were beating to the same rhythm. The city bloomed early that spring. Seattle's streets were dusted in petals from cherry trees that lined the quieter neighborhoods, their soft blush mirrored faintly in the morning skies. The air smelled faintly of wet bark and something new, something just beginning. Inside the penthouse, Layla sat in the nursery-to-be, now half emptied of its old blueprints and clutter. The room had begun to shift, no longer a forgotten corner of Ethan's past, but a quiet promise of what was coming. A crib still in its box sat against one wall. Stacks of children's books waited near the windowsill. She rested in the armchair Ethan had ordered without asking, one that swiveled and rocked. One she suspected he'd spent too long researching. A notebook lay open across her knees. Baby name lists, some crossed out, some circled twice. Grace, Eliana, Avery. She didn't know if they were having a boy or a girl. She didn't want to know. Something profoundly tender in the mystery made her feel like the future still held surprises, not dictated by scans or predictions. The door creaked behind her. Ethan stepped in quietly. He held 2 mugs of tea, one with a slice of lemon floating near the rim. She reached for it, her fingers brushing his as they exchanged warmth. "I saw a name in your journal," he said, settling onto the edge of the window bench. "Grace." Layla nodded. "It was my grandmother's." He didn't speak immediately, just stared out the window at the sun cutting low across the skyline. "Grace. It sounds like something we didn't know we needed, until now." She glanced at him. "You mean hope?" "I mean mercy," he said softly, "for the things we didn't do right the first time." They didn't talk much about the baby in terms of planning. No color-coded schedules or parenting books. Instead, the baby existed in the quiet spaces between them. A hand was placed gently on Layla's stomach during the night. A smile was exchanged when the baby kicked. Ethan instinctively reached for her when she winced, even though she said she was fine. But beneath that growing tenderness was something else. A tension Ethan tried to hide, but couldn't. He'd grown quieter in the evenings and spent longer alone studying. His smiles took an extra beat to reach his eyes. Layla noticed. Of course she did. One night, she stepped into his office as the wind rattled faintly against the glass. He was sitting at the desk, a blank page in front of him, pen in hand but unmoving. "You're writing again?" she said. He looked up, startled. "I'm trying to." She walked toward him, slowly. "Is it the journal for the baby?" He nodded. I thought I could leave something behind. In case I... He stopped, exhaled. In case I don't get to say everything in person. Layla sat on the edge of the desk, facing him. You don't have to live like you're already halfway gone. I'm not, he said quickly. Then softer. I just want to be ready if it happens. She was quiet for a moment. And if it doesn't? He looked up at her. Then maybe I'll learn how to stay. A few days later, they returned to the hospital for a follow-up. The specialist led Ethan through a series of scans and tests. Layla waited outside, fingers curled over the edge of her chair, trying not to let her mind spiral. When the door opened, Ethan stepped out, face unreadable. He didn't say a word, just reached for her hand and laced their fingers together. It wasn't until they were in the car, halfway home, that he finally spoke. They found something. Layla's heart slowed. A protein marker, he continued. The therapy's working. Not fast, not perfectly, but my heart's stabilizing. She blinked, not sure she'd heard him right. He turned toward her, eyes a little too bright. They used the word unexpected improvement. I've never heard a doctor say that with hope in their voice. The breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped all at once. She reached for him, not in panic or relief, just a quiet awe. You might have more time, she whispered. Maybe a lot more. She turned her face toward the window, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. So many nights she had held that fear in her chest like a second heartbeat. Now, for the first time, it was loosening. They drove the rest of the way in silence. But it wasn't the heavy kind. It was reverent, like sitting in a church where no words were needed, only presence. Chapter 2. That evening, Ethan paced the bedroom as Layla watched from the bed, amused. What are you doing? She asked. He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. Trying to find the courage I thought I already had. She sat up slowly. Ethan? He reached into the drawer beside the bed and pulled out a small velvet box. I married you for convenience, he said, stepping closer, kneeling beside her. But I fell in love with your heart, your strength, your fire. I don't want to be your husband on paper anymore. I want to be the man who wakes up beside you, every morning, every year, every version of time we're given. He opened the box. A ring shimmered inside, simple, delicate, not extravagant. Layla Monroe. Will you marry me again? This time, because we chose forever. She stared at him for a moment, utterly still. Then, without speaking, she pulled him into a kiss, full of salt, warmth, and trembling yeses. When she pulled back, she whispered, yes, 1,000 times, yes. The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit not just in size, but in meaning. From the nursery, the baby kicked once, as if in agreement. Ethan leaned down and rested his palm gently over her belly. Did you feel that? Layla nodded, her eyes bright with something too big to name. You know what I think? She said, voice thick. What? That he heard his name. Elias? She shook her head, smiling softly. No, she whispered. Daddy. At that moment, Ethan closed his eyes and held her close, the weight of that single word anchoring him to a life he never thought he'd have. But now, he couldn't imagine losing. The rain came softly that morning, just a whisper against the windows, like the city held its breath. Layla stood in the kitchen, both hands cradling a cup of warm milk, her fingers tracing circles around the rim. The silence was gentle, not empty. Across the loft, The world moved slowly, steam rising from the stovetop. The faint hum of the espresso machine Ethan insisted on fixing himself, a clock ticking somewhere too far to matter. It was their rhythm now. She looked down at her belly. It wasn't just round anymore. It was full, heavy, a curve shaped by life and possibility. The baby had begun to move with more purpose lately. No longer soft flutterings, but determined little rolls and nudges, like it had something to say but hadn't found the words. Ethan walked in barefoot, still in a t-shirt and sweats, his hair a little unkempt in the way that made him look younger, softer. He reached for the newspaper, something he still insisted on reading in print, and paused as he passed behind her, pressing a kiss just below her ear. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She leaned into the moment, into him, and let herself breathe. They spent the afternoon building the crib. Ethan had refused help from the staff, declaring he needed to do this one thing with his own hands. Layla wasn't sure if it was pride or guilt, but she didn't stop him. She sat nearby, cross-legged on the floor, handing him screws and watching the way his brow furrowed when the instructions didn't make sense. Halfway through, a wooden slat fell over and tapped his foot. He muttered under his breath, "How does anyone do this without a PhD in engineering?" Layla laughed. "You design medical nanotech, Ethan. You'll survive a crib." He paused, looking up at her with that half-smile she'd recognized as his quiet surrender. "I'm not sure this is the same thing." "No," she said, her voice softer now. "This is harder." And yet, by late afternoon, the crib stood upright, a little crooked in one corner, but beautiful in its imperfection. Ethan sat back, wiping a bit of sweat from his forehead. Well, it might not pass inspection, but it's standing. Layla slid next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. "It'll hold." They sat there, looking at it. This space soon to be filled. Neither of them spoke, but in the silence, something passed between them. A quiet understanding, a kind of reverence. That night, the storm finally arrived. It wasn't loud, just steady, a rhythm against the glass, like fingers tapping on the sleep surface. Layla woke first. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the baby. Perhaps it was something else. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting to feel a kick, a flutter, anything. But there was only stillness. Not fear. Not yet. Just stillness. She slipped from under the blanket and walked barefoot to the nursery. The room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of the city bleeding through the blinds. She stood beside the crib, her hands resting on the frame Ethan had built just hours before. She waited. 1 minute, then another, a breath. Still nothing. Still. Her palm moved instinctively to her belly. She pressed gently, then a little more, then paused. No movement. Her heart began to drum, quiet, restrained, but insistent. She moved to the hall, her voice low but urgent. "Ethan." He was already sitting up, as if he'd felt her absence before she spoke. "What's wrong? I can't feel him." Her voice broke, too soft to carry the weight of her fear. Ethan was out of bed in seconds, hands steady, voice calm. "Let's go. Now." The hospital lights always felt too bright at night. The hallway buzzed with the soft urgency of machines and whispered conversations. Layla lay back on the exam table, gown slightly wrinkled, her hand in Ethan's. The nurse moved swiftly, applying gel and adjusting the monitor. The room was still. Then, a sound, faint at first, then stronger. A heartbeat. Fast. Wild. Alive. Layla exhaled sharply, her body sagging in relief. "He's fine," the nurse said with a soft smile. "Just being a little dramatic, maybe." Ethan chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from Layla's cheek. "He takes after you." She shook her head, eyes damp. "He takes after both of us. He fights." They didn't leave the hospital until dawn, after every test had been double-checked. By then, the storm had passed. The rain had stopped, but the city was washed clean. Back home, Layla stood by the window, watching as the morning sun gently pushed through the clouds. Ethan brought her a fresh cup of tea, setting it beside her. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, gazing out into the brightening sky. "I was scared," she said after a long pause. "I know," he answered, his voice close. "But not just of losing him," she continued. "I was scared of what would happen to us if we did." Ethan turned toward her, resting his hand on the small of her back. "You're not alone in that." She looked up at him. "I didn't know I could love something I haven't even held," he said. "You're not alone in that either," she whispered. They stood quietly, with the world waking up outside their window. The crib waited in the next room. The future is still unknown, unwritten. But that morning, with the air still damp and everything smelling like new beginnings, Layla knew something deep in her chest. The child inside her already had more than a name. He had a father who had learned to hope, a mother who had learned to trust, and a story that would begin not with certainty, but with love. Spring deepened into early summer, the air growing heavier, sweeter. The city moved more slowly in the warmth. Coffee shops opened their windows, couples lingered longer on sidewalks, and sunlight found its way through even the grayest Seattle days. For Layla, time became both tender and tense. Each day brought the baby closer to them, yet the wait stretched like a delicate wire, taut with anticipation. The nursery was nearly finished now. Tiny socks folded in drawers, books stacked beside the rocking chair, and a mobile of paper stars turning slowly above the crib like a constellation waiting to be named. Layla spent most mornings by the window, journal in hand. Some entries were short, just a few lines about what the baby had kicked at, or which tea she was craving. Others were longer, letters written directly to the little life growing inside her. She often began with "Dear One," and ended with "See you soon." Sometimes, though, her pen would stop mid-sentence, not from lack of thought, but from emotion. There were things too wide for words, like the way Ethan held her hand longer after each doctor visit, or the way he started whispering goodnight to her stomach, as if the baby could already hear him. There were feelings too tender to define, gratitude so deep it frightened her, and fear so quiet it moved like shadows behind her ribs. One afternoon, she found Ethan standing at the entrance to the nursery, unmoving. She approached slowly, unsure if she should interrupt whatever thought had rooted him there. He turned when he sensed her. "I was just remembering." "Remembering what?" she asked gently. "The day this place was nothing but numbers and walls. And I—" He trailed off, then met her eyes. "I couldn't imagine anything growing in it. Not joy, not life. And now—" He didn't finish. He just stepped forward and placed his hand on the curve of her belly, as if that answered everything. Layla smiled softly. "It's more than just life growing. It's you, changing. He looked down at her, and something unreadable flickered in his expression. Not resistance, not regret, something quieter. Reverence, perhaps. "I didn't know how to love you," he said suddenly. "Not the way you deserve." She blinked. "You're loving me now." "Am I?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Or am I just trying not to lose you?" Layla was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and placed his hand over her heart. "You don't have to prove love, Ethan. You have to stay." That night, she dreamed of water, of walking along a quiet beach, her feet sinking into the sand, waves reaching for her toes. She carried something in her arms, wrapped in white cloth, warm and pulsing with life. But no matter how often she looked down, she could never see the face. She woke before dawn, breathing slowly, one hand resting protectively on her belly. The baby kicked gently, as if to remind her he was real. "Here. Now." She whispered into the dark. "I'm waiting, little one. Take your time, but I'm waiting." Ethan, too, began preparing in ways he didn't speak of aloud. He met with a lawyer to rewrite his will, something Layla hadn't asked for. He established a trust fund. He called his estranged sister in Portland and left a message. "It's been a long time, and I'd like you to meet someone." In quiet moments, he searched through old boxes, photographs from before the accident, letters his mother had written, music sheets with his scribbled notes in the margins. He wasn't looking for nostalgia. He was searching for pieces of himself he could offer this child. Not his company, not his legacy, but the human pieces, the ones built from sorrow and recovery, the ones shaped by regret and softened by love. One evening, as Layla slept, he wrote a letter to his unborn son. He didn't know what to say at first. Then he began. "I wasn't ready for you. I wasn't ready for love to find me through someone like your mother, strong and patient and painfully kind. But I'm learning, and I promise, even when I don't know how, I will always show up." He folded it, slid it into an envelope, and placed it inside the drawer next to the crib. It was the first of many letters he would write. On the last Sunday of June, the sky turned an impossible blue, the kind of blue that made people stop what they were doing to stare out their windows. Ethan suggested they take a drive, just the two of them. No destination. Open the windows, soft music, and the city stretches out in all directions. They ended up by the water, where Lake Washington rippled under the breeze. They sat on a bench, side by side, her hand tucked inside his, her feet swollen but bare in the grass. "This might be the last weekend," Layla said softly. "I know. Are you scared?" "Yes," Ethan admitted, "but not in the way I used to be." They watched a group of children racing each other near the shore, their laughter bright against the quiet lapping of water. After a while, Layla whispered, "Do you think he'll look like you?" "I hope he gets your eyes," Ethan said. "I hope he gets your steadiness. I hope he gets your fire." They turned to each other then, and no more words were needed. Only the wind through the leaves, the hum of a world still moving, and the quiet, sacred shape of waiting. The night it happened began like any other, calm, unassuming. The city had quieted under a curtain of dusk, and from the tall windows of the penthouse, Layla watched the lights flicker across the skyline, like stars being born, one by one. She'd always loved this hour, not quite night or day. It felt like a breath held between chapters. Ethan had made dinner, not well, but with heart. She had to fix burnt garlic, overcooked pasta, and a salad when his back was turned quietly. Still, he'd lit candles, played Miles Davis low in the background, and pulled out her chair like she was the only person in the world worth doing things right for. They ate slowly, not out of ceremony, but because every moment felt suspended, like a glass orb no one wanted to drop. After dinner, they lay on the couch, her head resting against his chest, his fingers moving gently through her hair. "I used to think I wasn't built for softness," Ethan murmured. "Not this kind. Not you." Layla tilted her head to look up at him. "But now?" He gave a half smile, eyes soft in the dim light. "Now I'm afraid of anything that might take it away." They didn't speak after that. There was no need. The moment had said enough. But sometime after midnight, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No screams, no sudden pain. Just a deep, instinctual awareness that something inside her had begun. Layla stirred. A tightness moved through her body, measured, unfamiliar, undeniable. She sat up slowly, hand resting on her belly. Ethan, who'd fallen asleep beside her, blinked awake when she moved. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, her breath slow. Then, calmly, "I think it's time." Chatsi. The hospital room was dimly lit and quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft voices of nurses. The world outside might have been spinning, but in here, everything had narrowed into a single purpose. Layla was calm, more than anyone expected. She remained grounded as each contraction surged through her body like a rising tide. Her fingers never let go of Ethan's hand, even when her grip turned steel. Ethan didn't speak much, but he didn't leave her side, not once. He counted breaths with her, whispered through clenched teeth when she needed strength, closed his eyes every time she winced, as if trying to absorb the pain himself. Hours passed. The sky outside changed color. The pain grew sharper. Waves turned to storms. And just when Layla thought her body might give out, just when she thought the distance between her and the child inside her was too far to cross, he arrived. A cry tore through the room, raw, sharp, new. Then, silence. A holy kind of silence. The doctor smiled. "You have a son." Layla didn't cry right away. She didn't speak. She watched, wide-eyed, as they placed him on her chest, his skin damp and warm, his tiny fists curled, his breath quivering against her skin. And then, softly, as if pulled from the deepest part of her, "Elias." Ethan's breath caught. She looked up at him, eyes blurred, voice trembling. "He's here." Ethan leaned in, brushing a kiss to her forehead, then to the baby's. His hand covered both of them. In that moment, everything stopped. The machines, the room, the world, they were still. There was only breath, and skin, and a love so fierce it stripped the past bare. Later, when the nurses had stepped out and the lights dimmed, Ethan sat in the armchair beside the bed, Elias in his arms. He looked awkward initially, unsure where to place his hands and how to support the tiny weight against his chest. But Elias settled quickly, resting one tiny hand against his father's collarbone, his breaths evening out. Ethan stared at him as if trying to memorize every line of this child's face. "I don't know what kind of father I'll be," he whispered. Layla stirred, her voice low but clear. "You're already being one." He looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. "How do you know?" "Because you're afraid," she said, her lips curving. "And you're here anyway." He looked back down at Elias. He's so small. And yet, Layla said, he holds more of our story than we ever could. When the city still slept in the early hours, Layla drifted off with her son cradled in the crook of her arm. Ethan remained awake, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing. The sun began to touch the horizon's edge, painting the walls in pale gold. He stood quietly and stepped into the hallway. There, in the stillness, he allowed himself to weep, not from grief or fear, but from something cleaner, something he didn't know how to name. He had spent most of his life trying to control time, but in that moment, as his wife and son slept peacefully behind him, he let time go. And time, for once, had given him something back. Seattle in July was a soft light, filtering through thick branches and spreading across the pavement like sheer golden scarves. The breeze skimmed the lake, gentle enough to make the lavender on Layla's porch sway, fragrant like a whispered secret. In the apartment once filled with tense meetings, unfinished drafts, and long silences, now lived soft moans, sporadic cries, and laughter so tender it seemed to dissolve into the walls. Elias. The tiny boy, with light brown eyes like morning mist after rain, lay peacefully in his mother's arms. The way he touched the world, bit by bit, sound by sound, light by light, touch by touch, slowed every breath in the house. Layla never imagined she could love someone so quickly. Not out of maternal instinct, not out of duty, but because just one small hand reaching out was enough to tell her that the rest of her life would no longer belong solely to herself. The first night was a quiet test. Crying, heavy breathing, worry stretches tight after every hiccup. Layla stayed awake for hours, sitting in the dark with Elias in her arms, sometimes just watching him sleep, confirming every breath was still there. Ethan, too. He wasn't good at soothing, didn't know the proper way to hold him, but he never refused to learn. On the third night after Elias came home, Layla woke up to find him standing in the dark, cradling the baby and singing, a tuneless hum with no lyrics, just breath whispered like wind. "I thought you didn't know how to sing," she murmured, voice raspy from lack of sleep. "I don't," Ethan replied, eyes still on the dozing child. "But it seems like this little guy doesn't care." She smiled, pulled the blanket over herself, and drifted back asleep. On the day Elias turned 1 week old, Ethan printed a photo of the sleeping baby, his hand across his cheek, mouth slightly open, face entirely at peace. He placed the photo in a small wooden frame and wrote on the back, "The day I realized the world could be this beautiful." He didn't tell Layla, not to hide it, but because some feelings didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be quietly kept. As Layla changed Elias's diaper that morning, she saw Ethan standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, but his eyes were far away. His voice was low, heavy, unlike usual. "Yes, I understand. A recurrence. What percentage?" Layla froze. She didn't need to hear everything to understand. Even though they had conquered one round of fear, many things still couldn't be certain. The condition in Ethan's heart wasn't a darkness that had been chased away, but a cloud always lurking at the edge of the light. When he hung up, his eyes found hers. "You heard, didn't you?" She nodded, slowly. "Just monitoring," he said. "Not bad news, just not fully at ease." Layla walked toward him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be strong anymore. Not with me." Ethan looked at her as if those words had been waiting far too long. "I'm not afraid for myself," he admitted. "I'm afraid he'll grow up not remembering my voice, not remembering this hand, not remembering the smell of these arms every time he cries. Layla gently placed her hand over his chest. Then stay, however long, one day at a time. Chapter. That night, she wrote a line in her journal. The strongest man I've ever known isn't the one without fear, but who dares to tremble and remain. Ethan began recording bedtime stories. Whether Elias understood or not didn't matter. He told me about the first time he met Layla, the first time they held hands in the rain, the first time they heard their child's heartbeat on a monitor. Each recording was saved, a library in his voice, a legacy built in love. One breezy afternoon, Layla brought Elias to the balcony. The baby opened his eyes, gazing at the sky. She whispered into his ear, "The wind is something no one can see, but everyone can feel. Just like love, just like your father's presence, even when he doesn't say a word." And in that moment, she knew. No matter how long the days ahead might be, she and Ethan had created a new world. One is born not from perfection, but courage. The courage to love when nothing is specific, and hope when no one promises to keep it. Elias was the continuation of something never whole. And because of that, he was more precious than anything. There were no fireworks when Ethan stepped out of the hospital for the final time. There was just a low sun dipping behind the skyline, and his breath was steady and sure. The last round of tests had come in quietly, as if not to startle the rhythm of a life now marked more by lullabies than deadlines. The prognosis was cautious, no promises, but there was stability, the kind that didn't shout or celebrate, only lingered softly, like sunlight across a cradle. He didn't tell Layla right away, not because he wanted to hide it. He needed to let the moment settle inside him first, this fragile gift of more time. When he walked through the front door that evening, he found her in the nursery, barefoot, her hair pulled into a loose bun, humming a wordless tune as she folded one of Elias's tiny cardigans. The baby slept soundly in his crib, one arm flung over his head in complete trust. Ethan stood in the doorway, just watching. "Everything okay?" she asked without turning, sensing him before seeing him. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. "I'm here," he whispered. "That's not an answer," she said, but her voice was smiling. He pressed a kiss to the nape of her neck. "It's the only one I needed to give." And for once, she didn't ask more. The seasons changed with quiet purpose. Summer gave way to an early fall, the leaves turning gold at the edges as if firelight had touched the world. In the mornings, the three of them would sit near the window, Layla wrapped in a sweater, Ethan sipping coffee, Elias tucked between them, with his eyes fluttering open to each new day. There was a rhythm now. Not one is defined by the past or dictated by fear, but a rhythm is born of small rituals. The sound of a rattle against hardwood floors, the scent of warm milk and baby lotion. The way Layla laughed without hesitation now, her whole face lighting up when Elias babbled a new sound or clumsily tried to sit upright. Ethan found himself memorizing these ordinary moments as though they were miracles. In truth, they were. One chilly morning, Layla pulled out a box hidden in their closet, photographs, letters, and one small notebook filled with sketches. "Things I thought I'd never share," she said, placing the box between them. Ethan, careful and quiet, lifted each item with reverence. A photo of her as a teenager with paint-smeared fingers. A sketch of a woman alone on a city bench, titled Sunday Silence. A letter she'd written to herself after her mother died, folded 4 times and worn at the edges. "You kept all of this?" he asked. "It was all I had," she said. "Before you. Before him." He paused over the final page in the notebook. It was a new sketch, recent. A man holding a baby against his chest, eyes closed, forehead pressed gently to the top of the infant's head. It was him. "You drew this?" She nodded. "It's the way I see you." Ethan didn't speak. He leaned forward and kissed her, softly, tenderly, like she was the most delicate thing in the world. One evening, months later, a storm rolled through the city. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder trembling in the walls. Elias stirred in his crib, whimpering in his sleep. Layla moved first, but Ethan reached out her hand and stopped her gently. "Let me." He padded into the nursery barefoot, the room lit only by the soft glow of the moon behind the curtains. He picked up his son with practiced ease, cradling him to his chest. "It's just thunder," he whispered. "Nothing to be afraid of." Elias quieted slowly, his small hands clinging to the fabric of Ethan's shirt. "Do you know," Ethan continued, "there was a time I was scared of everything? Of getting close, of failing, of loving someone so much it hurt." He rocked gently, rhythm syncing with the rain. "But your mother taught me how to stay. And you," he smiled at the boy, "taught me how to begin." Elias had fallen asleep again, breath soft against his father's collarbone. And Ethan stood there, holding him, as if the world couldn't ask him to be elsewhere. In the spring, Layla returned to painting. Not for galleries, not for clients, just for herself. She set up a corner by the kitchen window, where the light hit best in the mornings. Elias would crawl beside her, chasing dust motes while she worked. Sometimes, Ethan would join them, a book in hand, reading aloud even when no one was listening. Their home felt full now, not because of space or objects, but because every corner carried the sound of belonging. One quiet Sunday afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, Ethan turned to Layla and said, "Do you ever think about what we almost missed?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Sometimes," she said, "but only to remind myself how lucky we are." He nodded. Then, in a voice more breath than sound, "Thank you for waiting." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her fingers finding his. "I didn't wait," she whispered. "I chose, again and again." And they stayed like that, in the hush of a house that no longer echoed, in the softness of a love that had been broken, rebuilt, and finally made whole. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it would always be enough. Years don't pass with thunder. They slip in like shadows stretching across the floor, quiet, certain, slow. It was late autumn when Layla found the first strand of gray in Ethan's hair. She didn't point it out. Instead, she smoothed it back with her fingers and smiled quietly, tucking the moment away like a pressed flower in a book. He, in turn, had started watching her more often when she painted, less out of awe and more out of reverence, like she'd become a language he would spend the rest of his life learning. Their son, Elias, was 3 now, curious, bold, with his mother's unshakable calm and his father's stubborn chin tilt. He asked questions that drew adults into wonder and carried stories in his back pocket like treasures to share over breakfast. He called thunder sky drums and asked if people could be poems. Ethan had answered without hesitation, "Your mother is." One particular Saturday morning, The three walked through the neighborhood with sunlight spilling like honey across the floorboards. The leaves had turned gold and rust, crunching beneath their steps like secrets whispered to the earth. Layla wore a scarf Ethan had given her, a soft gray that matched the clouds above, and Elias ran ahead, arms spread like wings. They passed the old bookstore where Ethan had once hidden during panic attacks, and the mural wall where Layla had secretly painted a sunrise. Life had etched itself into corners they never expected to hold anything. When they reached the lake, Ethan paused. It looked the same as years ago. The water still, reflective. The same dock with weathered planks. But everything had changed. Not out there. In him. Layla slipped her hand into his. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. "I used to think healing was a destination," he said. "A place you arrive at, whole and untouchable." "And now?" she asked. He looked down at their son, skipping rocks without precision, but with all the confidence in the world. "Now I think it's a trail we walk, with bruises, with love, with someone beside you, refusing to let go." She leaned against him. "You're still walking." He nodded. "I always will." Back home, after lunch and stories and laughter spilled across the living room, Layla checked on Elias during his nap. She stood by the crib longer than usual that day, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled near his lips, the peace that radiated from his small, sleeping frame. Ethan watched her from the hallway. When she turned around, her eyes were damp but steady. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. If something ever happens, if one day I'm the one who needs to be reminded, tell me who we are. Tell me this is real." He didn't hesitate. "I'll tell you every day, in every way I can." And he did, not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with the way he brought her tea in silence when she had paint on her hands, with the way he memorized the curve of her sighs when she was too tired to speak, with the way he danced with her in the kitchen on rainy mornings, barefoot, slow, as if every second mattered. Years later, when Elias stood at his college graduation, tall, kind, and impossibly grown, he read from a piece of paper he'd written the night before. "My parents taught me that love isn't about perfection. It's about presence, about choosing someone repeatedly, even when the sky turns gray or the story changes direction. They taught me that silence can speak volumes, and that time, real time, isn't measured in years, but in shared breath." In the front row, Ethan held Layla's hand. Neither of them blinked during the speech, because they had lived every word. Some stories don't end. They find a quieter rhythm, a slower morning, a deeper silence, a look exchanged over dinner that says, without words, "We're still here." And in the end, that was the legacy, not wealth, reputation, architecture, or the canvases Layla painted. It was this: a home that hummed with laughter, a child who knew how to love without fear, a man who chose to stay, a woman who refused to run, and a life, not perfect, but brave, a life that whispered, gently, but endlessly, always. If this story moved you, let it live on. Like, comment with your favorite moment, and follow the channel for more stories that find their way to the heart. Because sometimes, all it takes is one quiet story to remind us what matters.